Alright you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Organized Rebirth. The lines have been drawn and the inevitable is now set to begin. The rift between the federal branch and the state branch of La Nuestra Familia began almost 20 years ago when Operation Black Widow broke. But now all the infighting and all the detraction is finally coming to a head. I know a lot of you were saying that the state was going to win, that the state was strong, and that the state was a force to be reckoned with in its own right. I think most of your assertions or predictions were influenced by wanting to see the agreement to end hostilities stay intact, and that it was more out of the sake of continuing to see unity amongst the raza. And I understand this, but I told you guys exactly what was going to happen, and all my predictions were spot on. Unfortunately, it has nothing to do with wanting to see unity prevail or out of what's in the best interest for our raza. I wish it was, but it's not. When all this stuff started happening and the truth filter began to make its way around, I dropped the exposition on the NF split and the NF insurrection to give you guys some solid insight into some of the things I knew were going to happen. It wasn't a fluke, I didn't guess, and these things just weren't predictions. These were all things I knew were going to happen based on my experience. Trust me, I hope the agreement to end hostilities somehow continues to remain in effect, and I hope that these guys somehow see that there's some good advantages to it, because it is good for our people. But that's one prediction I'm going to stay away from. Reason being is that I've always tried to be mindful and careful not to generate no pessimism or negative propaganda about it that might draw some kind of negative response by anyone involved. I'm not saying that my platform has that much power or influence, or that I'm even a factor in the big scheme of things, but I just don't want to be a part of any negative conversations that might imply that I played any type of role in it. It's just my personal preference. Rumors, false propaganda, speculation, I just don't want no part of any of it. Now, with regard to this spill that I've dubbed Organizational Rebirth, I'm going to share some information with you guys that I've been able to gather from an inside source that I've continued to be close friends with for almost 22 years now. I'm not going to expose the identity of the source because they want to remain anonymous for their own safety, but I will say this. For the haters and all those who think I'm working with the FBI, it's not the FBI. I've never worked with the FBI, and it's nobody involved or in any way, shape, or form associated with law enforcement. Just because I went through the situation in Santa Clara County doesn't mean that that defined me or that I just became a lifetime CI. People are going to draw whatever conclusions they want. But I've always been upfront and open with you guys, no matter how bad it made me look and no matter how much I didn't want to put it out there. The source is someone who's still involved in that lifestyle and who's extremely close to someone you guys have actually heard a lot about on some of these YouTube channels. And let me just share something else with you guys. You guys will be surprised how many active homies still continue to reach out to me for the sole purpose of sharing current information with me. A lot of these guys will ask me to give them the respect of not exposing them out of fear of reprisal. And I won't. I'll never break the confidence they've invested in me. But I'm just telling you guys this so you know that the information is coming from an inside credible source. So on September 16, 2021, a date specifically picked by the FBI for nothing other than mockery value and as an aspersion to the NF's anniversary, 55 members and associates were indicted on a federal racketeering conspiracy case that culminated after 5 years of complex investigatory work. This federal indictment, dubbed Operation Quiet Storm, targeted newly self-appointed leadership of the Nuestra Familia state branch. Following Operation Black Widow, this was something that the feds knew would be a forthcoming indictment for several reasons. The feds knew that the prior investigation, Operation Black Widow, would force the remaining body of the NF state branch to reorganize itself and to reappoint a new leadership after the FBI was successful at extracting the former leadership and having them commuted to the federal prison system. This was a no-brainer, as anytime you remove a gang or its leadership, it always causes a vacuum effect and a shift in power. Someone else moves in or someone else tries to fill that void. I'm sure that this was something they foreseen happening, as any second-rate gang investigator in the state could have predicted this much. And let's be honest about it, the NF wasn't exactly discreet about keeping this under wraps when it came to its own security and the info they allowed to be leaked out either. As far back as 2005, everyone and their mother knew that there was a rift between the former leadership and the remaining C's that were left behind in Pelican Bay Shoot. I knew as far back as 2002 and seen it continue to escalate while I was still out on the streets. In fact, I even orchestrated a massive meeting on the streets in 2003 amongst all the C's who were out there from all the active regiments in Northern California. Salinas, San Jose, San Francisco, Watsonville, the Valley, and the East Bay were all there in attendance. Others were supposed to attend, but couldn't make it. The whole purpose for the meeting was for me to basically rally the troops and get them all in line with federal leadership. And that's what I did. I ran the meeting in a backyard of a fellow N's house in Salinas and addressed all the things that are happening right now. I let them know that we were on course to be a part of a huge power struggle and that unfortunately a lot of good N's, hermanos, and C's were going to get caught up and crossed up in it. It's unavoidable because no matter what you do, you're going to have to choose a side and you're going to have to turn your back on the other. In this kind of situation, all you can do is follow your schooling and hope that you end up picking the right side. But regardless to what you do, and even though your intentions might be to just do the right thing, you're still putting yourself in someone's crosshairs as you're going to be forced to choose one of the two sides. I elaborated on all this and my purpose was to minimize the damage control that was bound to happen. I also encouraged all the C's and some trustworthy hermanos who were also there in attendance to follow suit with the former leadership that was en route to federal prison so that we'd all be on the same page. I guess I'll never know how much of an impact it had on the C's that were there that day, but in retrospect, when I look back at everyone who was there, 11 of the C's that were there have already been casualties in some way, shape, or form. There's others who remain active to this day, but now they're all in federal prison. Then there's literally already been dozens of other casualties who have fallen in both state and federal prison, with more who are undoubtedly in line to fall once they get sentenced and hit the federal prison system. It's an unfortunate circumstance because a lot of these guys were good solid C's, but all you guys are seeing right now is history repeat itself. It happened with Babo Sosa and the Black Bob Vasquez factions, and now you're seeing it repeat itself with the state and federal factions. So on September 16th, 2021, the worst case scenario played out for the state faction. A scenario that you could technically say was their worst nightmare. They all got slapped with a federal indictment, which now pretty much guarantees that they're going to be shoved into the federal prison system and have to face the same C's that they've been at odds with. The same C's that some of them have went as far as saying were no good and were no longer worthy of being recognized as honorable C's. That they were now going to be remembered on the wrong side of history. Corny and Skip were both labeled as traitors and tyrants who have preyed on their own so-called fellow C's. Those are some big words, and although I'm not going to say that these two C's are untouchable, I will say that they're definitely two of the C's in the federal faction that you don't want to have working against you. Now, when I addressed all this in my previous spills, I told you guys that it might take some time, but that I knew sooner or later one of a few things were going to transpire with respect to Conejo, Chuco, and DC. I told you guys that either a federal loyalist would infiltrate the state system and finish up with what Mateo and BJ had initially set out to do. That someone would slide up under them and try to take their win. Or I told you guys that if these guys didn't find a way to keep all the C's in the state content and fully on board with the direction in which they were now moving in, that one of them would rally up enough support and get a crew who would whack the leadership and knock those three down. It's not hard to imagine that they would have felt completely empowered doing it, knowing that they had an entire federal system standing firmly behind them. Not only that, but they would also emerge as martyrs and guerreros who were instrumental in bringing the whole organization back together. And then finally, I told you guys that eventually the inevitable was going to happen. They would eventually get taken down and hit with the federal indictment like all leadership has in the past. It's just part of the job description, and it's something that's virtually unavoidable. It comes with the territory. I knew it was going to happen, but I'll be honest, even I didn't think that they put these guys on the fast track and that it would happen this soon in the game. I imagine that it would probably happen in another 4 or 5 years, but I guess the FBI wanted to keep the pressure on and hit them with this second wave of indictments as soon as these guys reestablished their leadership. Now the FBI knew that there were a number of things that were about to transpire within the NF that had to happen in order for them to get back on track and begin operating again. This was a given. These are things that they've managed to learn from past indictments, not just from indicting criminal enterprises like the NF, but also with other criminal enterprises such as the ME, the BGF, and the ABs. Whenever you tear the head off a snake, terminology that they actually use in Operation Black Widow, there's always a regeneration process or a rebirth that requires appointing and delegating a new COC, chain of command, or the new leadership structure. The entire organization has to reassimilate and reconform to the new leadership. The street activities are also reorganized in accordance to the new leadership's expectations. This is common knowledge. New leadership, new policies, and a new way of doing business. Practically anyone can figure this much out if you just step back and put it all in perspective. But here's where things get a little messy. During this transitional phase, this process is usually fraught with a lot of missteps. In other words, the transition is not always a smooth one. There's a lot of mistakes and there's a lot of oversights. Due to the lack of cohesion, it's just a period that makes them more prone and more susceptible to encountering failure or law enforcement infiltration. Think about it. All these newly appointed Cs have been appointed all these new positions, and everyone's trying to adapt to this new machine that really has no congruity or cohesion. Some of this comes from Cs moving too fast, trying too hard to get things done, and basically just trying to fast track certain objectives. Then you have to look at things rationally and remember that a lot of these Cs are really not qualified to hold down these positions. They didn't earn them through years of rigid experience. Most of them were delegated these positions by de facto. When Conejo Chuco and DC began to establish this new leadership body, they had to make do with whatever manpower they had. They had meager pickings when it came to qualified Cs and Cs, and they ultimately settled for who was the best suited. So underqualification and lack of experience also became two of their biggest downfalls. Whether it was on the streets or behind the walls, lack of experience was detrimental. Another flub is the obvious lack of security when it comes to paperwork pertaining to street objectives either getting intercepted or falling into the wrong hands. How is it even logistically possible for some DOs on the streets to come into possession of some of these directives, i.e. the truth filter, the timeline statement of facts filter, the state's response filter, and the abreastment filter before it even reaches its intended destination? The state's accusations against Corny and Skip was probably the most inflammatory communication between these two factions, and in my opinion, this is what killed any chance of reconciliation. For the state to even insinuate that Corny and Skip were being demoted for the reasons they gave is where the point of no return was reached. I'm sure this is what bothered Corny and Skip the worst. In this same filter, they even made accusations against Mateo for cooperating with IGI, which is another frivolous allegation. Baby Joker decided he was done with the NF, but Mateo has not cooperated with any type of law enforcement, and this is another accusation they're going to have to answer to. This is the abreastment filter I'm alluding to, verbatim. To all C's and soldados and ends, I come before you all to address a serious matter to hold two carnales accountable for their actions, decisions, and crimes. Cornelius Corny Tristan and Sheldon Skip Villanueva. These two are being demoted to Cat 1 status pending further investigation. These two C's have lost their way and committed numerous constitutional violations which I will detail. All true, carnales know our storied history and our sacred laws. There is no split between the state and Fed carnales. Our Bible is clear on proper protocol. When any of the three seated generals becomes incommunicado, the best qualified carnales assume those seats. Article 2, Section 4, B. For those who say they have not been incommunicado, I tell you they have for over 15 years. These carnales have surrounded themselves with degenerates, Spider de Sacra and Jasper de Sacra, plotted with Mateo de Salas and Baby Joker de Guason. who both committed crimes against RO before cooperating with IGI and law enforcement. There are recordings on YouTube of Skip listening to a female, Peggy, bad-mouthing all carnales in Pelican Bay, see Art 4 Section 8, lying to him in an effort to have him lash out at her son-in-law. All this confusion could have been avoided if they would have reached out to me directly, but they have no means, and federal law enforcement has thousands of hours of tape that is currently being released on YouTube. C's in the feds are cleaning trash and rats. Travieso de Modesto, NGN, making him a C, Skip, and clearing a known rat, Mando Tabares de Sacra. Skip also allegedly pulled his son-in-law over the phone, and he was unqualified and uneducated. No C up against anyone's. I'm just reading this verbatim, so that part didn't make sense. But in closing, we do this with a heavy heart, but all will be transparent going forward. All carnales must be involved in putting our O back on track. We have a golden opportunity going forward. The rank and file are all on the same page, and all decisions have been made with the entire O's best interests in mind. The carnales and the feds need to look at all the facts and consult their Bible. There is no state or fed C's. We have one familia. No C is above the O's will or the will of the rank and file. All authority serves at the behest of the rank and file. We have a long history of C's who have crossed the line and been replaced or demoted. Our Bible is clear, and therefore the decision has been made according to our laws. Con respecto, from the office of GAO. How or why the state felt authorized to put a filter out like this just demonstrates the level of recklessness and how desperate they have become. They're pulling at straws trying to find any reason to justify their actions, but this was a fail. Skip has no control over what comes out of a spiteful or vindictive woman's mouth, and he wasn't allowing it. He was basically ignoring it. What's he gonna do? Jump through the phone and book her? But regardless, none of this paperwork should have fell in the wrong hands. These guys don't take security serious anymore, and law enforcement's biggest source of information gathering comes from paperwork that's intercepted almost on a daily basis. So now I'm gonna read you the state's response to the truth filter, just so you guys can refresh your memory on some of the things that were said, because it's important that you hear them again before I read the rest of this. From O Authority, filter, attachment on Corny and Skip, past indictments and state seeking response from C's and feds. The purpose of this filter is to, one, abreast C's and the feds of Corny and Skip's past indictment and decision making. Seeking a response from C's in the feds to work together hand in hand with the state, not Corny and Skip. Filter attachment. As Familianos, we are at a pivotal moment in our old storied history. A decision must be made by each of us that will either bring us together or pull us apart. The two options that lay ahead of us are: 1. State-fed C's go to war under the direction of Corny and Skip, or 2. State-fed C's do what's in the best interest of the O and come together to mend our differences and map out our future. To us, the choice is simple. We understand that Corny and Skip do not agree with every decision that the state has made. But let this be clear. A more prudent course would have been for Corny to, 1. Identify exactly what decision they disagreed with. 2. Request a full report on said decisions to investigate the reasoning behind them. And 3. Weigh these decisions to determine whether they actually benefited or were harmful to this O. In so doing, much of the confusion and misinformation would have been avoided, thereby allowing for a far better decision to be rendered. Unfortunately, this is not the course they chose. Several reasons have been made to iron out whatever disagreements Corny and Skip had with state leadership. These efforts, however, proved to be unsuccessful. The reason for this stagnation is because Corny Skip's, 1. Refusal to cooperate and compromise with the state leadership on the direction of this O. Article 4, Section 5. Conduct is unbecoming when it hinders the process of nuestra familia, or failure to cooperate or compromise with fellow familianos, and when negative conduct in words and actions are directed towards any C of nuestra familia. Article 6, Section 2. All C's shall set aside all personal goals and personal feelings, animosity, until said objectives have been accomplished. Objective, come together. Article 6, Section 3. A C familiano shall always strive to work hand in hand with other C's to push our familia forward. Article 6, Section 4. A familiano will always be subject to put the best interests of our familia first and foremost above all else. 2. Repeated attempts to deem certain C's no good and undermine the state authority, no good status. Article 4, Section 5. Conduct unbecoming, when negative conduct in words and actions are directed towards any C. Article 6, Section 5. Due process rights must be protected before revoking membership, honor, and any benefit entitled to a C. Article 6, Section 6. Due process. The gravest of matters must pass the most critical of reviews, undermine authority. Article 6, Section 1. A. The elected power and assigned authority of this familia comes from the free will and consent of the governed. They have created an atmosphere of mistrust and hostility that has allowed other C's under their influence to act out in a way that's disrespectful and hostile manner towards fellow C's in state territories. Article 4, Section 5. Conduct unbecoming, when it hinders the progress of the NF or when a C fails to recognize proper authority, or when negative conduct in words and actions are directed towards any C. Article 4, Section 6. No fighting verbally or physically between C's. Article 4, Section 7. All C's shall demonstrate proper respects to fellow familianos. It has become abundantly clear that the state leadership can no longer move forward in our efforts to mend differences with Corny and Skip. We understand the significance of their recently issued no good statuses and do anticipate some feedback from supporters. To these C's we say Corny Skip could have been deemed no good a few years ago, but were given opportunity to work through whatever differences they had with the state leadership. We were willing to acknowledge Corny and his COC as the head of our federal territories, under whatever titles they chose. Yet, through acts of their own and or through the decisions of other C's acting on their behalf, have continued to push this O towards civil war. Let it be clear, we C's in the state do not want to engage in any type of hostile acts towards our fellow C's in the feds. It is our position that enough has been lost. It is time for us to put our differences aside and do what's in the best interest of our O, which is to unite both the state and federal territories. Article 6, Section 1. The primary purpose and goals of this O will be for the betterment of his members through the building up of the O. Article 6, Section 3. A C familiano will always strive to work in hand with other C's to push our familia forward. If Corny Skip's current direction is allowed to prevail in our fed territories, i.e., the quest for unlimited power, it will lead us into years of bloodshed and uncertainty. In the end, maybe a decade or two later, when all those involved are dead and or gone, the remaining C's will be left to pick up the pieces and do exactly what we are attempting to do now, unite both the state and fed territories. This O would be better served if all C's decided enough is enough, no more fighting over power, and genuinely started working towards bringing this O together rather than tearing it apart. True, that would require some tough decisions, i.e., excluding Corny and Skip from talks because all they want to do is fight. But in the end, this O will be stronger for it. Article 6, Section 1. The primary purpose and goals of this O will be for the betterment of its members through the building up of the O, pinta calles, into a strong self-supporting familia. Article 6, Section 1. A. The elected power and assigned authority of this familia comes from the free will and consent of the governed. Now, had any of said decisions to rebuild and organize led this O into a weakened and unproductive path, then yes, corrective action would have been in order. However, that is not the case here. The O is in a much stronger and much more productive place than when the C's departed to the feds. Incommunicado, Corny Skip claimed that while in ADX they were not incommunicado. The state leadership says this is not true for the following reasons. By this O's definition, incommunicado means you are unable to securely communicate O business. So even if you have access to mail, visits, or phone calls, if none of these means of communications is secure, i.e. without law enforcement awareness or ability to decipher, then you cannot effectively communicate any type of O business. Hence, you are, by definition, incommunicado. In 2007 or thereabouts, we, the Bay, had not heard from the C in ADX in almost 2 years. Since their last directive from Alameda County Jail, we were unsure if and or what we would do or when we would hear from them again. So it was determined that no secure line of communication could be established. They were isolated and unable to be reached. No codes had previously been set up, and all their mail, visits, and phone calls, were closely monitored by Fed law enforcement. Therefore, by this O's definition, these C's were incommunicado. This determination was further strengthened by the following events. 1. From 2005, when the C's left to the Feds, until 2017, when the C's were released from the ADX. Not one single communication was received, no word for 12 years. And 2, in 2017, when Stork got out, he was asked about communication to the C's in ADX. He stated during the 9 years he was in the Feds, no secure line had been established to ADX, nor had he received word from them the whole time in the Feds. Cease hostilities agreement. Corny Skip claimed that the state leadership is wrong for agreeing to program with the MA on our yards. The state leadership says this is not true. To put the best interests of our familia first and foremost above all else. Article 6, Section 3. A C Familiano will always strive to work in hand with other C's to push our familia forward. Article 6, Section 1. The primary purpose and goals of this O will be for the betterment of its members through the building up of the O. True for the following reasons. The state leadership are not the ones to agree to a ceasefire with the MA here in California. That took place in 1994 in Pelican Bay Shoe. By then, the O leadership, when they agreed to the door policy with the MA. Corny and Skip were part of that same O leadership when that agreement was made. And the policy was still standing when the C's left to the Feds in 2005. Note, those exempt from this agreement include Bulldogs and TS. We did not criticize Corny and Skip when they chose to make agreements and walk the line with them in the Feds while we were still at war with them in the state. The ceased hostilities agreement, this is a term the attorneys came up with, not us. This is nothing more than an extended version of that same door policy. Therefore, none believed then or now that any wrong was committed when the same principles of the door policy were used to achieve mainline status. We understand things work differently in the Feds when it comes to the opposition. Now, had Corny Skip reached out to the state leadership in a cordial manner and called upon our assistance as Familianos, then it likely would have taken heed to their plight and made it our own. But as we all know, Corny Skip had criticized several decisions made by the state leadership, essentially deemed loyal C's no good behind those decisions. A few that they disapproved of the most are as follows. Appointed authority. Corny Skip claimed that the Viejo, which is DC, did not have the authority to set up state leadership. The state leadership says that this is not true for the following reasons. In 2005, when the then O leadership was transferred to federal prison, the last directive we, the Bay, received from them was that the Viejo was in charge of the O in California. There were no stipulations in regards to the limits of his powers. The Viejo was well within his rights to make whatever decisions he felt were in the best interest of this O. That includes the decisions to rebuild and organize, especially so once it was determined that the C's and ADX were incommunicado. Article 6, Section 1. The primary purpose and goals of this O will be for the betterment of its members through the building up of this O, Pinta Calles, into a strong self-supporting familia. Article 6, Section 1A. The elected power and assigned authority of this familia comes from the free will and consent to put the best interests of our familia first and foremost above all else. Article 6, Section 3. A familiano will always strive to work hand in hand with other C's to push our familia forward. Article 6, Section 1. The primary purpose and goals of this O will be for the betterment of its members through the building up of the O. In closing, we are not asking you as familianos to pledge your loyalties to this side or that side, state or feds. What we are asking, however, is for you to choose the path that is going to bring us together rather than pull us apart. We understand it will not be easy, as there will be those who remain loyal to an individual rather than to our sacred O. They will twist our old ideals in an effort to sound convincing. Keep in mind, however, those who fight the hardest or speak the loudest in support of Corny and Skip stand to lose the most when this regime is replaced. So their zealousness is likely tied more to their efforts to retain power than what's actually in the best interest of our own. We will sever them from the dialogue and realign ourselves with all true familianos who genuinely want to see an end to this needless bickering and infighting. We extend our hand to you, one familiano to another, and pledge our solemn vow to do whatever is necessary to bring this all together. Now let me just say this in regards to the door policy that they tried to use as fodder. That's not an extension of the door policy. An extension, the door policy was stipulated or was put into effect because C's were getting killed for no reason. They were coming out on the tier and they were getting shot for 2 minutes. You come out on the tier and you fight or you engage with the opposition for 2 minutes and you were getting shot. So there was no real purpose there. That's the only reason why the door policy was put into effect. For them to build off of that and to justify a peace treaty because of the door policy is wrong. I'm not saying that the agreement to end hostilities is wrong, but for them to use the door policy as leverage is not a good argument. It's just not. That's nothing more than a justification to try to justify their actions, which is wrong. So let me continue with this. So after Operation Black Widow, the FBI basically sat back, anticipated all this, and then lined all these guys up who had basically made themselves sitting ducks. With the C's that were left behind, they knew who was going to be part of the new leadership simply by process of elimination. Trust me, for as long as some of these guys have been back there in the shoe, and then considering who the new recruits were, it was easy to pinpoint who the new leadership was going to be. It doesn't help when you have guys dropping out on almost a daily basis, hand delivering these gang intel officers information. Anyways, before I start getting into the meat and potatoes of this and all of the things that I want to share with you guys, I want to touch on a few things first. I know that Gunner, Flacco, and Rojo have put a lot of content out on this federal indictment, and that's cool. The more info you guys get, the better informed you are. And it just gives you more perspective all the way around the board. I haven't seen all their videos, and I don't know everything they told you guys, but let me just emphasize one thing off the top. We all have different resources when it comes to gathering our information and content for our channels. So the only information I stand behind is what you hear right here on my channel. I don't stand behind nothing they put out, not because I'm saying the information is bad, but because I don't know who their resources are. I don't know what's speculation. I don't know what might just be theory, and I'm not involved with how they get their information. It's as simple as that. I will say that most of what they put out in the past has lined up with what I get, so their information is good. In fact, since I'm on this topic, let me just say this. I caught a quick glimpse of a video Gunner put out the other day where he was talking about the state faction being housed in Atwater and something about them reaching out to the Emmett for the sole purpose of possibly bringing the agreement to end hostilities to the federal prison system. Listen, I know Gunner's got good intentions and that he also strives to bring you guys good, accurate information, but I'd have to strongly disagree with what he said about that. I don't know if it was a theory or if someone told him this, but this doesn't make any sense and it completely defies how the NF normally operates. I'll tell you guys why. And again, I'm not only speaking from experience, I'm also speaking from my personal dealings with all these C's that are involved. And even more importantly, as a former member myself, I'm not bouncing no theories or possibilities off you guys, just so I have something to put some content out about. If I drop something about this, then it's because I know what I'm talking about or because I was able to get credible information about it. So, in the scenario Gunner gave, there's a few things that are just wrong with that whole picture. For one, the MA ain't stupid. The same way it used to be our job to stay abreast of what they're doing, and the same way we weaponize information by using it for our benefit, you can believe that the MA does the same thing. This is an early lesson we all learned from our training days when most of us read The Art of War. It's always to your advantage to gather as much information about your adversary as you possibly can. Who they are, where they're at, what they're doing, and how they operate. Trust me, they knew who they were, where they were coming from, and everything about them before they even pulled up to Atwater. Like Gunner said, Atwater is an Emmett stronghold, so they knew who and what was coming into their household. You can also believe that the Emmett is fully aware of the rift that's been taking place and that these C's have no clout, no authority, and no leverage in the federal prison system. Just like we all knew about that last rift between Benjamin Topo Peters and Ruben Tupi Hernandez. They know what's up too. Conejo and the others are even smart enough to know that the Emmett there would know this themselves. Even if I was to believe a crazy theory or story like that, I can see the Emmett there telling them, "Hey, gracias, we appreciate the offer, but if you guys can get your brothers to stamp that, who, by the way, are in full control of your gente here in the federal prison system, then maybe we'll take that into consideration." How stupid would they feel after that? Unless they were just desperate, I can't see it happening. They have other more pressing matters to think about anyway. So according to what I was told, these guys seemed like they were bummed out when they were being transported to Atwater. Usually for lifers who've been in state prison for 20, 30, or even 40 years, catching a federal case that will get you commuted to the federal prison system is almost like a blessing in disguise. In that scenario, you almost consider yourself lucky because everyone knows that federal prison is way better than state prison. These guys should have been happy that they were going to Club Med, where the golf and tennis courts are at. But from what I was told, it almost was likened to a bunch of dudes who were acting like they were on their way to the death chamber or something. The mood was somber, and there just wasn't a bunch of conversation. Everyone just seemed to be stuck in their own thoughts. I wonder what that was all about. You think it might have had something to do with what they all knew that they were going to have to now deal with? I would think so. So one of the most noteworthy things that I was told was that there seems to be a lot of division right now as well. Loyalty lines are already being drawn, and the separation is already starting to begin. This has nothing to do with the case or any of their legal endeavors. It's all about the rift, the politics, and the direction the state was moving in. This is something else I knew was going to happen, and the points of contention are easy to figure out. First, you've got the truth filter and the rift that was clearly being pushed by the state. Conejo, Chuco, and DC are the ones being blamed with spearheading the separation, but the entire body of the leadership is just as culpable as they were, all in support of it. In fact, only 2 C's in the state chose to align themselves with the federal branch, Mateo and BJ, and even then, all these other C's are accused of turning against them. I mean, let's really put this in perspective for a minute. When Operation Black Widow broke, it was the state faction that began calling for a separation between the 2 prison systems. Regardless of their reasoning or why they felt justified, they began sending out mandates to the streets and to all the different prisons in California, basically putting everyone on notice that the state and federal prison systems were operating under separate powers and that California was now being controlled by a newly appointed leadership. A self-appointed leadership that recreated a new high command and recreated the 3 high offices of generalship. This is when the crime of treason was first put in motion. They specifically stipulated that the elders or the former leadership that were commuted to the federal prison system were now overseeing the federal system, and furthermore that they no longer held any power, say-so, authority, or jurisdiction over the state of California. This was the beginning of the rift, and this is where it became contentious. In my opinion, they not only went about this wrong, but the state didn't even have the authority or the proper authorization to move forward with restructuring or recreating a new high command. If this didn't create enough bad blood, later it ended up turning personal when the state faction began making frivolous allegations about both Corny and Skip. They were both painted out to be tyrants and oppressors of the people. This was also a huge mistake. The personal attacks is when everything fell wayside, and now the only way this is going to be resolved is when the blood of those responsible for taking it there gets spilled. Now, I've heard a lot of people mention the NF Constitution, and I've actually even heard some people try to apply sections of it to whatever side they felt was either right or wrong. When I heard this, I couldn't do nothing but shake my head and laugh about it, because for one, this isn't the United States Constitution, where you're dealing with all kinds of rhetorical verbiage and a bunch of other constitutional loopholes. This is the NF Constitution, and unless you were a member, you shouldn't try to spin it or speak on it unless you know for sure that you know the correct interpretation. Trust me, there's a lot more to it than just the written words you see or read. Unless you've been educated on it and taught the true correct interpretation on it, you can't even begin to understand it. Some of you in the comments acted like you were political theorists or comparative constitutional law experts. Again, we're not talking about the United States Constitution. This is the NF Constitution. I know the NF Constitution like the back of my own hand. I lived by it and studied it religiously for years, sometimes reading it 20 and 30 times a day. We called it our Bible because we studied it in a religious type of fashion. Almost 30 years ago, when I first became a young seed, the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning in Pelican Bay was roll up my mattress and all my bedding, throw some toothpaste on my grill, wipe my floor down, and then I make a cup of coffee. Once I finished going through that morning ritual, I'd get my Constitution out and then I'd read it over and over. I kept reading it until I memorized it and until it almost became second nature. My point is this. I know the correct interpretation of the NF Constitution, scope and breadth. So for those of you who are going as far as to recite portions of the Constitution in an effort to justify who's right or wrong, you guys need to stop. I heard one of the viewers on one of the lives the other day say something about portions of the Constitution can be used or applied to justify different things for their benefit. If you're talking in terms of piecemeal by slicing it up in sections like the state did in its response filter, then that might be true, but not when you know the proper interpretation in its totality and not when it's implied in its proper form. There's a lot of unwritten things that you as civilians don't know, and that's where people get it twisted. I'll tell you guys like this without getting too deep into the NF Constitution and its verbiage. It is true, in one portion of the Constitution, it does stipulate that Pelican Bay will always remain headquarters and that this is where NF leadership will always be stationed. Those of you who are trying to run with that and use this as political fodder to justify the state faction maintaining control of California don't know what you're talking about. This whole section became irrelevant and obsolete when everyone was moved from the SHU, including the state faction itself. So this doesn't matter either way. The other thing you guys don't seem to understand is this. The organizational governing body, which is now the majority of all Cat 3s, has the power to impose major changes by way of 3/4 majority vote in any given situation it deems necessary. Here's one of the sections that applies. Section 5B. Whenever the General Council becomes incommunicado either permanently or temporarily, the General Council will assign from the ranks of said Cat 3 to either permanently or on an interim basis the best qualified, the guardianship of the Nuestra Familia. This authority lies solely with the General Council. They decide the scope and breadth that the assigned Cat 3 shall serve in their absence. The decision is to be adhered to by all members. This section of the Constitution was followed as guardianship of the Familia was delegated to DC on an interim basis. Once the General Council, the Inner Council, and High Command determined that these bodies were not completely or temporarily incommunicado and that they still had the ability to oversee the Familia, guardianship of the Familia was then retracted and DC was advised that forthcoming directives would be coming. That's what happened. While these brothers were housed in Santa Rita or the Glen Dyer Detention Facility in Oakland, they revised portions of the Constitution. This pertained to the designation of HQ headquarters, the restructuring of leadership, the dual functions of both state and federal prison operating under one collective body. Furthermore, they developed contingency plans for any ensuing indictments or circumstances which might render the upper echelon incommunicado or temporarily out of commission. All this was done, and up until that point, the state was on board. But then the state decided that it wanted to control California and that it wanted to keep these two bodies separate. This is when the state went outside the scope and breadth of the Constitution by restructuring its own high command and granting several Cat 3 statuses without the proper authorization, and thus skirting the required voting process that should have been held by the duly elected high command. You guys understand that? I know some of you don't. So like it or not, whether you're in support of the state or federal faction, the state faction violated the Constitution and the decrees that have already been in place. I told you guys this before in one of my other breakdowns, but this is where the federal branch is clearly justified, and this is where they can't be rebutted. So the Constitution clearly states that major changes or amendments can be made to the Constitution under a 3/4 majority vote. What people fail to understand is that almost the entire HC High Command was indicted in Operation Black Widow, and that they had the numbers according to the Constitution to amend the changes when they were in Santa Rita. This is when the proper amendments were made, and they revised the portions that related to the designation of headquarters, new amendments governing leadership, and new procedures when the entire upper echelon was indicted, as they were in Operation Black Widow. Like it or not, the state faction was at their mercy, as the General Counsel, the Inner Counsel, and the 3 high offices were all indicted in that case. When Corny, Tibbs, Tex, Huete, Pinky, Skip, and Stork were indicted in Operation Black Widow, only 26 C's remained in Pelican Bay Chute under DC's guardianship. And DC was the remaining brass member left behind that was indicted. He was the only remaining brass member. The only remaining Cat 3s left behind in the state were DC from Chino, Güerito from Los Baños, and Boxer from Selma. That was it. Conejo from Sacra had been demoted and stripped of his Cat 3 status, so he technically shouldn't have even been involved in the process. He was demoted to a Cat 1, and it was stipulated that he would never again hold a position of authority, nor would his Cat 3 status ever be restored. All the other Cat 3s who were in custody were indicted in Operation Black Widow. What did the state think it was at liberty to do? Delegate a bunch of new Cat 3s and delegate its own 3/4 majority vote in order to regain control? The federal faction was the properly elected leadership, period. They had all the remaining Cat 3s there in Santa Rita that they needed in order to cast a 3/4 majority vote and make the amendments which would have kept them in their positions. And that's what they did. Now, the other point of contention is the agreement to end hostilities that was established with the EME and the ABs. Again, everyone knows that Chuco and DC were the ones who brokered this agreement, and that they were ultimately the ones responsible. But again, some of that accountability lies with the body of their leadership, as they were all strong supporters and they all championed it as well. Both of these issues not only drew sharp criticism from the federal branch, but they also called this a clear act of treason. The federal branch looks at any form of peace treaty, standstill, or truce as an act of treason. And this is just a different belief system. So just imagine all these C's from the state that are all housed at Atwater and what kind of atmosphere they're in right now. They're all pointing fingers at each other. Loyalty lines are being drawn. Certain C's are separating themselves from other C's, and they're all trying to push the accountability away from themselves. It's going to be interesting to see who they're going to salvage, who they're going to give a pass to, and of course, who's going to become targets. I don't see Conejo and Chuco overcoming the charges of treason, mutiny, and other high crimes that they're being charged with. But DC's situation is going to be interesting. If Tibbs and the consideration he got at his age for just declaring his support for the state faction is any indication or a means of measuring DC's fate, then it obviously don't look good for him. But I guess only time will tell. Now, one of the other noteworthy things that I was told about is that there seems to be a massive amount of communication going on right now, which is to be expected. Politics are in full swing, and all this apparently started as soon as the indictments were announced. And it's coming from all directions. C's that were left behind in the state are reaching out to the federal faction, trying to double deal and play some of the separation between themselves and Conejo, Chuco, and DC. The federal branch immediately reached out to other C's left behind in the state, such as Mondo from Delano, Belucas from Oakland, Sleepers from San Jose, and a few others. The federal branch wasted no time, as they allegedly are trying to use DCs in an effort to rally support and bring the entire organization back together. Whether or not it works is just a matter of opinion. I guess it just depends on how much they bought into Conejo and Chuco's agenda and their propaganda when it comes to the agreement to end hostilities. Because there's no doubt in my mind that there's a lot of skepticism by not only some of the C's, but also by some of the hermanos and some of the N's who are assuming that if the federal branch regains control, it could possibly be detrimental to the agreement to end hostilities. Who knows what's going to happen, but I'm sure Conejo and Chuco use this as one of their strong points. Meanwhile, while all this other communication is taking place, the most interesting attempts at reaching out has actually come from Conejo, Chuco, and DC themselves. Supposedly, these three have attempted to reach out to Corny, Pinky, and Skip. Whether or not it's falling on deaf ears, I don't know yet. But as soon as I find out, I'll let you guys know. I mean, what's there really to say? That they were misinformed, that they got their wires crossed, or that they were trying to do what was in the best interest of the organization? I doubt Corny or any of the others have any words for them until they catch one of them on a yard. But as of right now, all the possibilities are open. Now, the other thing that's going on right now is that a lot of these individuals are weighing their options when it comes to their legal dilemmas. This is typical in these kind of huge cases where there's multiple defendants who are looking at life. I know a lot of you think that all these guys are true believers and that none of them would ever cooperate, but don't ever put it past anyone who ends up in that situation. You could be the downest guy out there who's always carried himself like a straight soldier, and you could have even been through a couple of these big indictments in the past, but that doesn't mean you won't fold the next time you end up in that situation. A lot of it just depends on the circumstances, what's going on in their personal lives, the politics, and the amount of time they're looking at. But when you're faced with that kind of adversity and it's your life hanging in the balance, reality has a way of putting things in perspective. That's just the way it is. I've seen a lot of these cases play out, and this case definitely ain't no different from any of the others I've seen. Let's not forget that there's a total of 55 defendants in this indictment, so not all of them were in custody when this indictment broke. Two prominent San Jose Norteño-based street gangs, SJG, San Jose Grande, and EHP, El Hoyo Palmas, were also wrapped up in this indictment as well. Both of these hoods have always had extensive involvement with the NF and are probably two of the most active Norteño gangs in San Jose. In fact, there were a handful of SJG members that got caught up in the Lencho indictment and the Kramer indictment, so they've apparently continued to stay involved. Both SJG and EHP are multi-generational Norteño street gangs that have acted as subgroups for the San Jose street regiments. Benjamin Big Happy Mendez, Luis Looney Rodriguez, Frank Manos Gutierrez, and Nicholas Primo Mendez were four that I vaguely remember. Back then, Nicholas Mendez was going by Primo, but I guess he's now going by Primetime. I believe there are a few more from SJG, but I'm not positive, so that's why I didn't include them. EHP is another hood that was real active out there, and in 2006, 13 of them were indicted in a case dubbed El Hoyo Palmas. This was one of the biggest gang cases in the history of Santa Clara County. They actually constructed a special courtroom just to accommodate this trial because there were so many co-defendants. The main four defendants in this case were Jean Shorte Sanchez, Samuel Castro, Michael Negro España, and Orlando Gangster Rojas. These four youngsters were charged with 4 murders, several attempted murders, numerous shootings, and so many other crimes that it took the court clerk over 90 minutes to read all the charges. These youngsters were part of a small crew of EHP gang members who were driving around the streets of San Jose looking for sureños to shoot. They finally got busted when they were being surveilled, and they ended up killing an unaffiliated locksmith who was just wearing a blue shirt. According to these latest indictments, the Nuestra Familia is a prison gang whose members are housed in various California state prisons, but whose power and authority extends well beyond the prison walls. Outside of custodial settings, the Nuestra Familia organizes geographic territories throughout Northern California into groups known as street regiments. These indictments further describe how street regiments are divided into smaller subsets or hoods, based on the local neighborhoods where their members reside or where the gangs operate. Street regiments then collect money from these hoods, typically in the form of monthly dues or taxes on profits from illegal activities such as drug dealing, some of which is then to be provided to the Nuestra Familia, basically 25%. That's how it works, and it sounds like it's been business as usual. These two indictments represent just how committed law enforcement agencies really are at keeping up the pressure and doing everything they can to break, disrupt, and interfere with the Nuestra Familia both on the streets and in some of the California state prisons. A principal objective of San Jose Grande and El Hoyo Palmas street gangs was to generate profits through narcotics trafficking, robbery, and other criminal activities. The operation demonstrates that the FBI, in coordination with other law enforcement partners, will use all the tools they have at their disposal to quell the violence on the streets. On the screen, you guys should now be looking at a graph that shows everybody that was indicted, everybody that was in state prison, and everybody that was on the streets. Well, actually, the one on the streets are mentioned after these graphs. The first indictment, filed August 12, 2021, addresses the San Jose-based street gang known as El Hoyo Palmas. The 6 defendants in that indictment are Jose Garcia, aka Bones, Juan Gonzalez, aka Crazy Indian or Trigger, Paul Valenzuela, aka One Eye, Caleb Eller, aka Chuckles or Skank, Kyle Leonis, aka Little Green, and Juan Dominguez, aka Green Eyes or Nito. The indictment alleges that El Hoyo Palmas is a multi-generational norteño gang that is a subgroup of the Santa Clara County Regiment and operates in and around the San Jose area. According to the indictment, El Hoyo Palmas derives profits from illicit activity, and its members provide monthly dues or contributions to the Santa Clara County Regiment for distribution to the Nuestra Familia. The indictment alleges defendants conspired to commit crimes including acts of violence to make money, benefit El Hoyo Palmas, and increase their status within the gang. The El Hoyo Palmas indictment has 3 counts. Count 1 of the indictment charges Garcia, Gonzalez, Valenzuela, Eller, and Leonis with conspiracy to commit Hobbs Act robbery in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1951A. According to the indictment, these 5 defendants conspired in September and October of 2018 to commit a robbery that would have obstructed, delayed, and affected interstate commerce. Counts 2 and 3 of the indictment allege that in October of 2018, Garcia, Gonzalez, Valenzuela, Leonis, and Dominguez conspired to commit murder and assault. Count 2 alleges that the defendants conspired to commit murder in aid of racketeering in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1959A. While Count 3 alleges the defendants conspired to commit assault with a dangerous weapon in aid of racketeering in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1959. If convicted, the defendants charged with 1. Conspiracy to commit Hobbs Act robbery face a statutory maximum of 20 years in prison. 2. Conspiracy to commit murder face a statutory maximum of 10 years in prison. And 3. Conspiracy to commit assault face a statutory maximum of 3 years in prison. The court also may order additional terms of supervised release, fines, and restitution. They always do. Nevertheless, any sentencing following conviction would be imposed by the court only after consideration of the U.S. sentencing guidelines and the federal statute governing the imposition of a sentence, 18 U.S.C. 3553. The second indictment, also filed August 12, 2021, addresses the street gang known as San Jose Grande. The defendants in the San Jose Grande indictment are Joshua Hernandez, aka Sleepy G, Giovanni Correa, aka Gio, Andrew Enchando, aka Indo or Little Indo, Charles Pineda, aka Taco, Alicio Martinez, Snow or Snowman, and Nicholas Mendez, aka Primetime, or the one that went by Primo. Like the El Hoyo Palmas indictment, this indictment alleges that San Jose Grande is a multi-generational norteño street gang that is a subgroup of the Santa Clara County Regiment to which its members pay dues or contributions. At the center of the indictment is a list of more than 24 transactions in which one or more of the defendants allegedly engaged in activities to promote the aims of San Jose Grande. The list includes alleged participation in the sale of narcotics, the sale of firearms, armed robberies, a stabbing, a home invasion robbery, and other acts of violence. The defendants are all charged in a single count of racketeering conspiracy in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1962d. If convicted, the defendants in the second indictment face a maximum statutory sentence of life in prison. In addition, the court may order terms of supervised release, fines, and restitution. Nevertheless, any sentence following conviction would be imposed by the court only after consideration of the U.S. sentencing guidelines and the federal statute governing the imposition of a sentence, 18 U.S.C. 3553. Basically the same sentencing guidelines as the EHP indictment. I hate to be the one that sounds pessimistic, but all these youngsters from EHP and San Jose Grande are definitely the weakest links, especially the ones looking at life, and everyone knows it. These are the ones who I'm sure they're already keeping a close eye on. It's nothing personal, but it's just a fact. Guys coming off the streets who are out there enjoying life have a harder time going through that transitional phase. They have to get through that phase where they're basically losing everything they got, wives, kids, all their toys, and just the life that they had become accustomed to living. The ones who are already in prison have already been through all that. But then again, if they have a date and they still had a chance to get back out there, then this is what they're going to struggle with. Are they going to go all the way and continue to play the game, or have they reached a point to where they still place some value on life and might consider tapping out? Lifers have nothing to gain either way. Unless the feds are really willing to wheel and deal by vacating their life sentences and commuting them to federal prison with a release date, then they have nothing for them. It's highly unlikely, but anything's possible. The feds can do it. One of the last things I want to touch on before I wrap this up is the situation concerning Mateo from Salinas. After doing a little more research on his circumstances, I was able to gather some very interesting information about what really happened to him. Apparently, there was a lot more involved than what the state faction was putting out there, because from what I found out, a lot of C's in the state not only turned their back on Mateo, but they also used false propaganda against him. They had an agenda, and that was to get him off the yard. Not because Mateo was mounting an offensive to move on Conejo, DC, and Chuco like they claimed, but because he was out there calling them on their bullshit and trying to get them back in line with the federal branch. That's why they considered him a threat, and that's why he got put in the situation he was in. Put yourself in his shoes. What would you have done? Mateo was from the old school. He's from the same generation I was from. He was in line with the leadership that we both have been under since we became C's. Corny, Pinky, Skip, Tibbs, and all the others who were part of high command. He was falling in line with them like I was doing when I was still out there on the streets back in 2003. If this is the leadership we've always known and we were following the Constitution like we were supposed to, then what else do you expect? Was Mateo and BJ supposed to follow suit with Conejo, Chuco, and DC simply because DC said that they were authorized to restructure the state? A real brother doesn't bend or break his beliefs like that. You do what you were schooled to do, even if it means you have to take the hard road instead of the easy road. The Constitution can't be manipulated or applied to justify breaking NF law. You can't. It's clearly written. Only tyrants and renegades attempt to place their own spin on the Constitution's interpretation so that they can use it for their own benefit. Those C's who are responsible for laying their hands on good C's like Mateo and Baby Joker are going to be held accountable. They're going to have to answer for doing what they did to both of those brothers. BJ chose that he had seen enough betrayal, and he ultimately decided that he was done with the NF. But Mateo, on the other hand, didn't allow this to discourage him, at least not to the point of changing his beliefs. But the sad part about all this is that he slammed back down, and they won't let him back out on the main line because of what the state faction did to him. I'm not just talking about their attempts at trying to spill his blood. I'm also talking about all the false propaganda they spread about him that's now keeping him locked down. After Mateo was slammed down, they must have hit him with about 100 to 150 1030s. For those of you that don't know what 1030s are, they're called confidential disclosure forms. I'm not pointing any fingers at anyone, and I'm not dropping any names, but a lot of ends that were out there on the yard or who were involved in that incident gave confidential statements about Mateo and him being in hot water. This is now the reason why he can't get himself back out to a mainline, because of all the confidential disclosure forms he's now got against him. Even I bought into the false propaganda when I first heard about it. I assumed that Mateo was getting ready to mount a strike because I knew he was in line with the federal branch and wouldn't just allow these 3 C's to coordinate a mutiny. And the source I heard it from is reliable too, but he apparently was wrong. It was true that he was speaking up and that he was addressing both Conejo and Chuco, but according to what I just found out, he never said or committed to physically bringing it to any one of those 3. He wasn't plotting a coup like everyone said he was. He was simply letting Conejo, Chuco, and DC know that they were wrong and that they weren't authorized to do what they were doing. All he was basically doing was being a thorn in their side. He was speaking up and being the mouthpiece that the federal branch needed out there. Of course, on the other hand, they probably felt like he was also a set of eyes out there for the federal branch as well. Did this justify sending a squad of C's and N's to hit him? They're the ones who went to stab him. All he did was protect himself. Bottom line, Chuco just wanted to get Mateo out of the way so he could continue to push his agenda. He knew that things would have been a lot easier once Mateo was out the way. So that's what it was really about. The story about Mateo attempting to put a small crew together to take out the state's self-appointed leadership was all false propaganda. They even went as far as saying that Mateo was emphatically against the agreement to end hostilities that Conejo, Chuco, and DC were in strong support of. They concocted this story in an effort to turn the whole yard against him and justify deeming him as a threat. Hopefully the intel officers in CDCR conclude that this was all frivolous information so Mateo can get back out to a mainline sooner or later. Again, another good C falls behind bad politics, and most of it's all money motivated. Politics 101. Your own so-called brothers jostling and maneuvering to get your position. The federal branch has already demonstrated how serious they are about their plight when it comes to wiping out any C's or N's who are loyal to the state's self-appointed leadership. This was evident when they targeted a C from Salinas named Spanky. In February, Spanky and his wife were both shot on the streets of Salinas, and this was undoubtedly a message to all state-backed C's and N's that they run the risk of being targeted and killed if they continue to push or promote the state-backed agenda. There's either going to be a lot more bloodshed before it's over, or these C's and N's in the state are going to start aligning themselves with the federal branch and come together under one collective body. So I'm sure these guys in Atwater have a lot to think about. This case will undoubtedly play out like all the other indictments in the past. The 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the millennium, and now 20 years into the millennium, history's repeating itself once again. Each indictment carries its own set of dilemmas and problems for all those involved. Backbiting, finger pointing, playing the blame game, and loyalty lines being drawn are all things that slowly begin to permeate. The only difference about the situation these guys are in is that they got something to think about with regards to the political dilemmas and the unavoidable fallout that they're all going to be in. That's a lot to shoulder, so let's see what happens. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. We're working on releasing more phone calls, chapters, and other material, so stay posted on your alerts. I'll be dropping more updated stuff on the federal split and the indictments as I get it. Thank you all for continuing to support us. And one last thing on our other channel, Paradigm Entertainment Productions. I'm sure you guys have noticed that there's a lot of old duplicated content on that channel. This is only to get our watch time hours up. As soon as that channel's monetized, we're going to be dropping some other content on that channel that's going to be geared in another direction. But it'll be fire, so stay subbed to that channel.